Why do some brands fade away while others stay around for decades? What can online sellers do to build a long-lasting brand? And how can they use marketplaces to help them achieve this? Keep watching to find out. Today on E-Commerce Heroes, I'll be talking to Richard Hurtley. Richard set up a lifestyle fashion brand after leaving university, which he then ran for several years. He is now the MD of Rich Insight, who help brands gear up for growth on marketplaces. We'll be talking about why it is that some brands just fade away and exploring what it is that online sellers need to do to build long-lasting brands online. This month's video sponsor is ShipBob, an innovative service that automatically manages and fulfills orders from your online store. So Rich, there are a lot of schools of thought about what a brand is and the characteristics that a brand has. So to set the scene, what is a brand?
Okay, good question. I think there's a few different definitions of brands, and having looked into it a bit, so one from the American Marketing Association is around, it says a brand's a name, term, design, symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's good or service as distinct from those of others. So the key things there for me are like identify and distinct. And then there's another one from the Business Dictionary that brings out differentiation, obviously around the consumer's mind, trying to create kind of credibility, quality, satisfaction. Which I think again is the point, because you're trying to conjure something up in their mind. It's not just a kind of a static thing, as it were. And then obviously it also talks about benefits and values. But for me personally, the ones I really like is we once did this event, which we run, called Retail Recharged, and we had a speaker on stage, Bob Willett, who was the former CEO of Best Buy, and he said, "People buy what you stand for, not what you sell." And I just really, really like that. And it's always stayed with me as a kind of something that really sums up what a brand is. I think it's what you stand for as a business. And another one that I quite like that Simon Sinek espoused in one of his books is that people buy why you do it, not what you do. And again, I think that resonates with lots of the brands that are, well established today. They've got a strong sense of purpose and reason. And I think that's really important. So I think it's really about sort of intent and symbolism. I think really kind of getting to the bottom of what a brand is. And that's what differentiates it from just a product. Because I guess a product is just a way of satisfying that intent or need. And that's kind of the way I would see them as different as well.
Okay, and if we take that forwards, you see some brands that kind of maintain great visibility for decades, and other brands, fade away. They just seemingly disappear. So what are some examples of brands that have just faded away, and why do you think that was the case?
Okay, yeah. So there's a few brands that I can think of. I mean, some of them are still going, so I don't want to be kind of too rude about them. But I just think they had big opportunities that perhaps they didn't realise. So the one that immediately springs to mind is around TiVo, which is obviously a way of sort of recording television. It was very cutting edge at in its day, and it was better than a lot of the DVRs that kind of existed at the time. But the reason they didn't really grow, to a lot of people's judgment and mine as well, would be the fact they didn't communicate effectively with an audience, and also they probably were quite complacent to their competitors, which were the cable companies that ended up taking over in that space. So I think that's an example of, a business or a brand that never really was, but could have been like a massive player in the global market. And Motorola is another one. I mean, there's a couple of phone brands actually, but Motorola is another one. They launched that Razr. I don't know if you remember that Razr phone that used to be really trendy, and everyone had one, and it was a very hit product. But basically, 4 or 5 years later, they just had a huge downturn, and they weren't innovating enough, and the one product wasn't strong enough in its own right. They just didn't have the follow up, and I think that's another example of maybe a brand that didn't really realize a bigger opportunity just because it was maybe too not innovative enough and didn't focus more on the product rather than building the brand around it. I think Blockbuster is another interesting one because I mean they had a lot of opportunities to evolve and they've never really taken any of them, in my opinion, which is a shame because I think everyone loves the brand and everyone grew up with. I remember getting the videos as well as the DVDs, before there was DVDs, and I used to love that whole experience. And I think they could have become an online proposition. There were so many opportunities and so much time and potential acquisitions that could have enabled them to do that, but they just didn't adapt and they didn't innovate. And I think another example of a wasted opportunity, I think, in my opinion. But yeah, so the key trends, I think, in terms of why brands faded away are, purpose. So people who perhaps lacked the why and the reason they exist. I think adaptability. So brands that either haven't wanted to or didn't feel it was appropriate to adapt or couldn't adapt in their eyes. Obviously innovation, which ties into that, but actually just making sure your products are leading the way rather than following. I think that's always going to be key in any vertical, actually. Obviously complacency. I think we're all businesses are run by humans, all brands are run by humans, and we can be a complacent species, and I think that's the reality. So I think particularly bigger businesses suffer from that, and they obviously can move much slower as a result as well, which doesn't work in their favor. And obviously focus. So actually, some of the best businesses I think really focus on doing something really well. And trying to own that. And I think many of those businesses, I think, maybe lacked a little bit on when it comes to focus to kind of get them through the storm, as it were. So that would be my response on that question.
And I mean, you mentioned some of the characteristics there, but on the sort of flip side, what characteristics do the real successful, long-lasting brands tend to have?
There's quite a few, and in terms of specifically on the brands, I mean, this is very subjective. So I'm talking about the brands that I really like. But I mean, Apple's the obvious one. I mean, everyone loves talking about Apple, maybe a bit less now than they used to because it was a bit cooler back in the day. But one thing I really love about Apple is it's always been, particularly obviously with Steve Jobs at the helm, but it was always a very purposeful business. It always started off in everything with why it existed and then told you what it did. And I think as a result, it had a huge amount of loyalty, and it obviously innovated massively because it was trying to solve a visionary problem that actually we didn't even know was there. And I think for that reason, I think it's definitely standout, and it's to this day a phenomenally successful business. What I quite liked, so Steve Jobs gave it a mission statement, which was to make a contribution to the world by making tools for the mind that advance humankind. And that's a very compelling kind of thing to buy into, whether you're a customer or an employee. And I think it kind of gave it real vision. I mean, but interestingly, I looked at it again to see what it is now. And honestly, it's the blandest statement about the products they offer and the fact they do phones and they do computers and they're all very good. I mean, honestly, it's just so dull. And I think that says a lot about how the brand's evolved and perhaps where it's lost its way a bit. So again, I think looking at mission statements, and I know some people are of the mind that, this stuff's all very airy-fairy and doesn't add any real value. But I totally disagree. I think if you know your why and your purpose and your reason, and you've got something exciting as a mission to get people behind, all the best businesses have got that, and that's not a coincidence. So I think from a brand perspective, that would be kind of my takeout from that particular one. I think Harley Davidson is an amazing brand. I mean, if you think people get this tattooed on their body for the rest of their lives, and it's a corporate emblem, I mean, it's nuts, really. And there's, and the reason for that, in my eyes, it's very clear as to what it represents, and it's a symbol of something. It's a lifestyle statement, actually similar to Apple in one respect, in terms of it. In different ways they tell something about you as a person. It's telling a story by having a bike or by loving the brand, and I think that's really key. And interesting, having looked into it, their mission statement is, we fulfill dreams through the experience of motorcycling. So it's about fulfilling dreams. It's about like giving someone the emotional tie of what they need. It's not about kind of the engine or the other things that obviously people might love a Harley for, but it's more than that. I think that's the point. So again, like a brand with real kind of intent and clear symbolism. So I think in summary, what they all have in common is purpose and clarity. I think they all know exactly what they are, why they exist. I think all of them are focused on or know the importance of innovation. So they're not resting on their laurels. I think they're very customer centric in the main. and they're focused on what they do and doing what they do well. And then obviously the consistency point, I think, is really interesting, because that's quite hard to actually do that. And actually, so to try and create sort of a scalable consistency to a brand, however big or small you are, is actually very tough. And I guess evolution, like they've realized that if you want to be a long-term brand, if you're here for a long time, you need to evolve like any of us, do, to exist. So make sure evolution is within the DNA of your business, because if it isn't, then you're going to have issues down the line. So yeah, that's what I would sort of say in that respect. And I think, when, often people use brands to validate their lifestyle, and I think it very much is a statement of them. So I think the key thing is when it feels right, you're happy to pay the premium. And the way you get someone to feel like it's the right decision is because you emotionally kind of connect with them. And I think, so there is logic and rationale and all those sorts of things, but you've got to have the emotional connection to it. All of those businesses, in some respect, whether it's because you're starving, you see a Big Mac and you want a meal, or whether you're, saving up to buy your next pair of Nikes, either way, you've got this emotional connection, which is more than just, product benefits and features. It's actually kind of a slightly deeper connection, and that's what gives them loyalty. And I think all of those brands have got a real tribe behind them because of those things. And that's what you need to build a brand.
Okay, and you mentioned there that, a lot of your examples are the so-called the big boys. And a lot of our viewers are small businesses. So kind of looking at what you've just mentioned and the sort of landscape for small businesses, how can small businesses go about building a brand that does last?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So there's a few kind of elements to this. But I mean, just to give one example, first of all, of a business, going back to the mission statement point. I know that can all sound very grandiose and like, we're not there yet. We need to get our business off the ground before we start having these sort of visions of grandeur, etc. But actually, I've worked with a company that I really admire, that I think have got a very strong business. And when I worked with them initially, they were year one. They just started out. They were getting successful, but it was very early stage. And they're a brand called Look Fabulous Forever, and they basically do this fantastic sort of makeup cosmetic brand for 55 plus ladies. But it's very positive in terms of how they talk about things. It's not anti-age. It's like a real refreshing take to an industry which is very different in terms of the way they treat aging. And they've got a really nice sort of mission statement. So what they say is, we're on a mission to lasso a generation to look, feel, and live fabulously forever. And that's kind of their mantra. And I think it's great. And they don't see themselves as a makeup brand. They see themselves as a movement. And I think, having that vision, having that kind of, very long-term view on things really makes an impact. And I think if you ever meet the sort of founders who have, who do think big and have big visions, there is a very distinct difference between them and the ones that are just looking by their feet at what the next step is in isolation. You need to have the big vision to then know the direction of travel to then make those steps forward. So I think it's, whilst it can sound a bit optimistic or a bit of a nicety, it's important to have a vision to then progress. So that's just one thing I thought would be good to mention. So in answer to your question in terms of what you can do as a brand, so sort of breaking it down, there's a few things. So one is purpose. So going back to that point, you need to think big, in my opinion. So why do you exist rather than what do you do? So first of all, answer that question. And it's remarkably difficult to answer that for most businesses, I think, because it's not a question you often ask yourself. What I would say would help is to create your own mission statement, going back to what we were just discussing. So try and bottle up in one sentence and do make it a sentence, because if you saw the thread earlier, they were all very simple statements. If it's too complex, it doesn't work. Make it as simple as possible and make it something that articulates your why and your reason for being. And that I think makes a big difference. And also what's great about that is then you've got something to communicate with your stakeholders, whether it's your eventual employees, if you're on your own at the moment but you're going to bring in a team, if it's your potential investors, or if it's maybe other businesses that you want to buy your wares. Like it gives you a little bit of a flavor for those other things. So I think that's really important.
Okay, Rich, and my final question for you is if I'm a small seller and I've just started selling on marketplaces, how can I use marketplaces to build a long lasting brand?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very important question because so much traffic is now coming from marketplaces online that you've got to have some visibility, and you can't really ignore that as a platform. So obviously, there's a few different things depending on the marketplace that you can do. But there's on certain marketplaces, Amazon, eBay, etc. You've got some branded environments that you can utilize, which can help create some consistency in the space, and obviously give you a bit of a nuance to kind of just a generic kind of non-branded product, etc. And there's obviously things like enhanced listings and other things that you can do content-wise to try and showcase your brand in a better light than perhaps just again some sort of cross-border product that's just very vanilla. So I think those are a few things. I mean, obviously there's more and more performance marketing now that exists on the platform. So obviously you can use that to be aggressive and to push your brand into new areas, into different customer profiles, and try and kind of get some more traffic to you as a brand or to specifically products that you offer in a search traffic criteria. So I think that can help. I mean, the key thing really is that with marketplaces you can go global with relative ease. So I think it's a very if you're looking for a global brand, or if you want to become more than just domestic brands, then it's a great way of expanding, and it's often the cheapest for smaller businesses, which is why I think it's somewhere you need to be. Obviously, the trend is more and more towards marketplaces. So we're talking about a lasting brand. If that's the future, then you need to be at the future. Going back to the adaptability point, so you really need to kind of take your customers with you and kind of I guess be there rather than waiting for it to be a default setting for everyone. So I think that's definitely what we would say. And obviously, having visibility of your competitors, like on a marketplace, you're quite genuinely in a marketplace. So you have to see what's happening in the market. Your sales are affected by other brand promotions. It's like being a market stall in a market. And if someone on the corner goes on discount, it affects you. Now, if you've got a shop on a high street, you might be aware of that. But if you've got an e-commerce store sitting in isolation where you're just trying, it's very hard to sometimes understand the reasons behind a fall off in traffic or certain other things that you can speculate about. Whereas within a marketplace environment, it's a little bit more available. So I think that kind of can really help people kind of really understand, what's happening in their space. And I think, stuff like, as well as competitors, you've got the whole grey market, counterfeit goods side of things as well. So actually being aware of what's happening there, maybe you need to do some more enforcement of your brand, etc., is key. But just distribution more generally, I think, you to achieve on marketplaces, you need to be very tight on your distribution, and it enables you to have visibility of that and hopefully start enforcing stuff around that, which otherwise you're not aware of, or you're losing sort of touch with. So that's what I would say are some of the benefits. I think it is interesting now, though, obviously with Amazon Choice and with voice search through Alexa, etc., how things are evolving to almost cut out maybe some of the default branded side of things. It's going to be more a question of what brand particular marketplaces align to, and those criteria are going to be quite essential, I think, to a lot of the brand success or not. But I mean, I suspect a lot of that will be based on very rational, criteria. And the reality is that brand isn't just a rational space; it's an emotional space. Going back to what we were talking about, so you kind of need to have a place to display a more emotional, creative sell rather than just the stats, because not everyone views things in that way. And if we think about what we've bought, I'm sure we could have always found things cheaper that are similar, but we often are happy to spend more money because we know of that brand, and that is still ingrained within us. And I don't think these platforms, are necessarily geared up to that. So it's going to be interesting to see how they create a brand environment and a place for brands to play and to showcase what they're great at, which is trying to get people to buy into what they do and sell the dream. So I'm interested to see how that evolves as well. But I think those are a few things.
Well, Rich, thank you very much for joining me. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank this month's video sponsor, ShipBob, an innovative service that automatically manages and fulfills orders from your online store. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone for watching, and we'll see you again for another episode of E-Commerce Heroes here at Web Retailer.